The European Union is made up of three fundamental bodies, each representing a distinct group within the Union. These institutions, namely the Council of the EU, the Parliament and the Commission, each play a vital role in the functioning of the EU's machinery. Despite the distinct and complementary roles these institutions play, it is the Council that ultimately holds the greatest power in directing the EU. In this video, I will base my arguments on the trialogue process in order to illustrate this asymmetry in power. The European Union is a complex set of institutions working in synchrony to run the Union. Among these institutions, there are three main bodies as mentioned before. The Council brings together the governments of member states, the EU Parliament is the body that represents the people of the EU, and finally there is the Commission, which can be said to represent the EU project itself. One of the great priorities of the EU in the last couple of decades has been to increase the efficiency of decision-making amongst its institutions. A successful approach to this goal has been to implement the co-decision process, which refers to the formal obligation for the Parliament and the Council of Ministers to agree on any proposal before it can become law. It's a strategic process for finding common ground between the interests of national governments and the EU Parliament. Each side knows it must accept a compromise, and this acceptance means they can focus on efficiency. This way of working has paid off, and now policy making in the EU is surprisingly streamlined. In step with this will for efficiency, the bodies of the EU carry out a negotiation process for legislation known as the trialogues because of the participation of the three main bodies of the Union. In the trialogues, the Commission makes its proposals on legislation, and the Council and the Parliament negotiate how the proposals can be passed. The Commission is present, but usually doesn't participate actively in the negotiations. The trialogues are really negotiations between Council and the Parliament. This is the way negotiations work in theory, as a balance between the three bodies. However, examining the nature of each of the institutions, it is possible to understand the true role each of them plays in the trialogues. First, we examine the Commission. This body has had a reputation for being the undemocratic puppeteer of the EU in the eyes of many Eurosceptics. However, Bickerton explains that the Commission's monopoly on legislative proposals has been replaced by a much more complex process where ideas and proposals are constantly circulating around the Brussels bubble. The Commission's power has been diluted by other institutions and by the increased role of Parliament. The Commission's role is certainly vital, but it is by no means the most powerful institution of the EU. Second, we explore the peculiar evolution of the Parliament. In the last decades, this body has obtained increased power over the decision-making process in the EU. Nevertheless, and rather paradoxically, as the powers of the institution have expanded, fewer people have bothered to vote in European elections. This raises questions regarding the legitimacy of the institution. It is not fulfilling its purpose in representing the people, and yet it has become a central cog in the European Union's legislative machinery. Bickerton explains that the Parliament's success is actually largely due to this fact. Given that it doesn't represent all the competing interests that it should, it means the institution can be more united and therefore play a stronger role in the EU. The Parliament prioritizes its capacity to pass laws smoothly over its daunting mandate to properly represent people that do not support it. Finally, we come to the Council. The Council's task is to give a general direction to the EU and its institutions. In theory, there is supposed to be a balance between the interests of individual states and the interests of the EU as a whole, represented by the other two institutions. However, Bickerton holds that there has been a weakening of EU institutions because governments have become wary of delegating more powers to them in case there is a public backlash. As the supranational spirit fades, it becomes easier to see the influence of member states, but not all member states hold the same influence. This depends on their size and wealth. Bickerton argues that considering certain member states' real power, as opposed to the limitations and shortcomings of the Parliament and the Commission, it is clear to see that, in the end, the most power in the EU lies in the hands of the dominant countries, which are represented in the Council. The Council of Ministers is the legislative heart of the EU, and it ultimately determines what direction will be taken by the Parliament and by the Commission. As Bickerton puts it, without the political will of member states, proposals go nowhere.